I'd like to welcome you to the House, Minister, and I'm glad to have the opportunity to speak on behalf of the Labour Senators in support of this bill, and indeed I was a co-sponsor of it and have worked on the issues it addresses with colleagues in civil society groupings, in particular with the Irish Council for Civil Liberties. And I just want to commend Senators Lynn Ruane and Alice Mary Higgins for bringing it forward, and to note also that it has received support from a wide range of civil society organisations and NGOs, 65 I'm told, including ICCL, as I've said, Amnesty, and indeed the Wheel, which is an umbrella organisation for civil society groups, for community and voluntary organisations, charities and social enterprises. As others have said, the bill has a straightforward purpose. It seeks to define it seeks to offer a definition of political purposes that addresses the problem existing that has been identified with the Electoral Act 1997 as amended in 2001, which has effectively imposed funding restrictions having a really negative effect on the work of civil society organisations. So, because the definition of political purposes in the original legislation is so vague that it can be interpreted and applied in a broad fashion, it has brought a wide range of organisations within the scope of the Act, despite their activities not being directed in any way at influencing the outcome of an election or referendum. And SIPO, as others have said, SIPO, the Standards and Public Office Commission, themselves have identified the problem in the legislation. Indeed, in 2003, they noted in their annual report that the scope of the current law is so broad that it may cover such bodies as tidy towns, committees, charities, representative organisations and other interest groups. So SIPO have suggested change. They've doubted that it was the intention of the legislature that these bodies, in conducting their ordinary affairs, would find themselves covered by the legislation. And they recommended a different definition be offered. So SIPO has identified this. We've also seen concrete examples of organisations that have fallen foul of the current definition. We saw it with the Amnesty case in 2018 that others have referred to, and we saw it with the voluntary group campaigning to end the so-called baptism barrier, the group Equate, which was compelled to hand back a starter grant. There's also an international dimension to this, and we should be aware that the EU Fundamental Rights Agency, for example, has been critical of Ireland for operating funding rules that have had the effect of shutting down the work of some human rights organisations. And closer to home, the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission has highlighted the negative impact of the restrictions on advocacy. So it is an important point that is being made in this bill, and it's an important issue to be addressed. And because of that, it's very disappointing that the government are not supporting, at least to allow the bill to go through its second stage. And I know government speakers have identified flaws. I know that Atheist Ireland has corresponded with us about flaws it suggests in the bill. But private members' bills can be amended at committee stage and report stage. And indeed, we've had lots of experience of that. And, you know, in the last Shannon term, I brought forward legislation to amend the Competition Act. And colleagues who were in the Houses then will recall that the government had identified flaws in that, but we won a vote on second stage, and as a result, I worked with government officials and with government ministers, and we amended by agreement the competition, the amending legislation, and we brought forward a very important bill that safeguards and protects the rights of freelance workers to engage in collective bargaining. So, you know, it was a really good example of how private members' bills can be amended and indeed improved upon through collaborative working with government. So, you know, I mean, I do welcome the government's announcement of an electoral commission. I think that's very welcome indeed. And I know that there's been, I think, a good deal of correspondence and negotiation between Senator Ruane and Seb in her office and government officials. So that's welcome too. But at the same time, I think it would have been preferable simply to let the bill go through second stage, and then we could all work together on identifying flaws, on seeing whether the aim that we seek to address in the bill could be addressed in another way. And, you know, I think there are useful suggestions coming through around, for example, looking at the charities legislation, looking at amending definitions there rather than necessarily just using this sort of legislation. So, for example, the Charities Act could be amended to enable promotion of human rights under the category that currently protects religious organisations, and others have pointed out the anomalies there. I think also that you know, we could look again at whether this approach is better or or whether the SIPO approach is better. And SIPO's recommendation in 2003 was that they would keep the current definition of political purposes and capture third parties if they intend to spend over a certain threshold in advancing such a purpose, whereas this bill doesn't have any threshold and amends the definition of political purposes to excluding those groups unless they're spending money during an election or referendum. So there are different models, certainly, to address the problem, the current problem that is restricting and curtailing the activities of groups advocating for human rights. And I don't think any of us on the side of the House that is supporting the legislation, I don't think any of us are saying it's perfect, and I think it's been acknowledged that we would be very happy to work with government to ensure that the bill could be amended and that any flaws that it does contain could be addressed, through, as I said, at committee or report stage, and indeed then at report stage. But in the meantime, it's very important, Minister, I think, that Ireland is seen to take a lead on promotion of civil society and protection of civil society. And I do think in a debate like this it's worth just reflecting on the huge contribution to Irish society that civil society organisations have made. And I've worked personally with so many groups on so many different campaigns, referendum campaigns on marriage equality and on repeal of the 8th in 2018, of course, but also in between referendums and quite outside of referendum processes and electoral processes on other very important campaigns, on campaigns around the extension of multi-denominational schooling, for example. As a parent in a local community, I was one of the people who got a new Educate Together school established. So that's the sort of low-level local campaigning that goes on and that many civil society groups are very much engaged in on a day-to-day basis. And I think the problem with the current definition of the Electoral Act is that it unduly hampers the work of groups like that. And there are ways, sensible ways, in which we can address the restrictions that I think were not foreseen or intended indeed. And again, as SIPO has said, and as others have said, the restrictions that were not intended at the time of the passage of the legislation. So, I think we should be working together, Minister. I'm sorry we can't simply agree and move forward through second stage tonight and see the bill go to committee stage and then all work together to bring forward amendments to ensure that we're not bringing in any unintended consequences and that we are simply seeking to enable the flourishing of civil society organisations in our society. Thank you, and again to commend Senators Ruane and Higgins for bringing this forward.
Thank you.